Michel de Montaigne was born into a world that believed certainty was strength, but he would spend his life proving that uncertainty, when faced honestly, could become a deeper form of wisdom. He was born on February 28, 1533, in the region of Aquitaine in southwestern France, at his family estate, known as the Château de Montaigne. This estate was not simply a house. It was a symbol of stability, tradition, and inherited identity. His family belonged to the rising class of wealthy landowners, not ancient nobility, but successful through commerce and service. His father, Pierre Equum, was a man of unusual vision, deeply influenced by Renaissance humanism, a cultural movement that believed in the value of education, classical knowledge, and the development of the individual mind. Pierre did not want his son to grow up limited by tradition or narrow thinking. He wanted him to become a person capable of understanding himself and the world clearly. To achieve this, his father designed one of the most unusual educational experiments of the Renaissance. From the moment Michel was an infant, his father arranged for him to be surrounded by Latin rather than French. Latin was the language of scholars, philosophy, and ancient Rome. It was not normally spoken in daily life. But Pierre believed that if Michel learned Latin naturally as a native language, he would have direct access to the wisdom of classical thinkers without the barrier of translation. Servants in the household were instructed to speak Latin. Tutors communicated only in Latin. Even when Michel was very young, he heard and absorbed the language continuously. This immersion shaped his mind permanently. Latin became not just an academic subject, but part of his natural thinking. Through this early exposure, Montaigne developed an intimate relationship with classical authors such as Seneca, Plutarch, Cicero, and Lucretius. These thinkers would later become central companions in his intellectual life. His father's educational philosophy extended beyond language. He wanted Michel to associate learning with pleasure rather than fear. In an era when children were often forced into strict discipline, Pierre chose a different path. He avoided harsh punishment and encouraged curiosity. He believed that fear could produce obedience, but not genuine understanding. This approach allowed Montaigne to develop a mind that was independent rather than submissive. He learned not because he was forced, but because he was interested. As Montaigne grew older, he was sent to the College de Guyenne in Bordeaux, one of the most respected schools in France. There, he received formal training in rhetoric, philosophy, law, and classical literature. He excelled in his studies, but more importantly, he developed a lifelong habit of reflection. He did not simply memorize ideas. He examined them. He questioned them. He compared them to his own experience. This habit of questioning would later become the foundation of his philosophical method. After completing his education, Montaigne followed a practical path expected of someone in his social position. He studied law and entered public service. He became a magistrate in the Parliament of Bordeaux, a regional court. This role placed him within the machinery of government, where laws were interpreted and enforced. It exposed him to the realities of human conflict, ambition, and injustice. He saw how legal systems attempted to impose order on human behavior. Yet he also saw their limitations. Laws could regulate actions, but they could not fully control human motives, emotions, or contradictions. It was during this period that Montaigne met one of the most important figures in his life, Etienne de la Boétie. La Boétie was a fellow magistrate, but more importantly, he was a thinker of rare depth and sensitivity. Their friendship was immediate and profound. Montaigne would later describe it as a connection so complete that he could not explain it through ordinary reasoning. They shared intellectual curiosity, emotional openness, and philosophical reflection. They discussed classical philosophy, human nature, politics, and the meaning of life. This friendship became a central emotional anchor for Montaigne. La Boétie had written a remarkable work titled Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, in which he explored a disturbing question. Why do people obey tyrants when they outnumber them? He argued that tyranny persists not merely through force, but through psychological habit and acceptance. People become accustomed to obedience and stop questioning authority. This idea deeply influenced Montaigne's understanding of human behavior. He saw that many social structures exist not because they are inevitable, but because people accept them without reflection. But this friendship, which had brought Montaigne such intellectual and emotional fulfillment, ended suddenly. In 1563, La Boétie became ill and died at the age of 32. His death devastated Montaigne. This loss confronted him with the fragility of human life. Someone who had been present, alive, and intellectually vibrant was suddenly gone. The experience forced Montaigne to confront mortality not as an abstract idea, but as a personal reality. He realized that everything human beings build, relationships, achievements, identities, exists within the shadow of eventual disappearance. This confrontation with mortality became one of the central themes of his philosophy. Rather than avoiding the thought of death, Montaigne believed it must be faced directly. He argued that fearing death excessively weakens life. If a person spends their life trying to avoid death psychologically, they become trapped in anxiety. But if they accept death as a natural and inevitable part of existence, they can live more freely. In the years following his friend's death, Montaigne gradually withdrew from public life. He fulfilled his duties as a magistrate, but his interest in official roles diminished. He began to feel that public ambition and political involvement could not provide lasting meaning. He had seen how quickly life could change. He had seen how fragile human plans were. He began to turn inward, toward reflection and self-examination. In 1571, at the age of 38, Montaigne made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He retired from public office and returned to his family estate. There, in a tower of his chateau, he created a private library. This tower became his sanctuary. It was a circular room filled with books containing works by classical philosophers, historians, poets, and thinkers. On the wooden beams above, he had quotations from ancient authors inscribed, reminders of wisdom accumulated across centuries. In this quiet space, removed from political responsibility and social expectation, Montaigne began a project unlike anything that had existed before. Instead of writing about abstract systems or universal truths in the traditional philosophical style, he began writing about himself. But this was not an act of vanity. It was an experiment. He believed that by examining his own thoughts, fears, habits, contradictions, and experiences honestly, he could uncover truths about human nature itself. His subject was not himself as an individual ego, but himself as an example of humanity. He called these writings essays, a word that meant attempts or trials. He was not presenting final answers. He was exploring questions. He wrote about fear, friendship, death, education, habit, uncertainty, and the limitations of human knowledge. He did not pretend to be perfectly consistent or certain. In fact, he openly acknowledged his contradictions. He believed that human beings are not fixed entities, but constantly changing. His most famous question became the foundation of his philosophy. What do I know? This question was not an expression of ignorance, but of intellectual humility. Montaigne recognized that human perception is limited. People often believe they possess certainty, but their beliefs are shaped by culture, habit, and personal experience. By questioning his own assumptions, he created space for deeper understanding. Inside his tower, surrounded by books yet focused on his own inner experience, Montaigne began quietly transforming philosophy. He was no longer trying to explain the world as an abstract system. He was trying to understand what it means to be human. Inside the quiet circular tower of his chateau, surrounded by shelves filled with the voices of ancient thinkers, Michel de Montaigne began the work that would eventually redefine the very nature of philosophy and literature. Unlike philosophers before him who attempted to build structured systems explaining reality, Montaigne did something far more personal and, in its own way, far more radical. He turned his attention inward. He began observing himself with the same seriousness that others used to study the external world. He paid attention to his thoughts as they arose, to his emotions as they changed, to his habits, fears, preferences, weaknesses, and contradictions. He did not attempt to present himself as an ideal or perfected human being. Instead, he presented himself honestly, with all the instability and inconsistency that defines human existence. He understood that human beings are not fixed objects but living processes, constantly changing from moment to moment. By documenting his own internal experience, he believed he could reveal something universal. This work became his Essays, first published in 1580. The word itself reflected his intention. These were not declarations of final truth. They were attempts, explorations, ongoing investigations. He wrote about subjects that had rarely been treated as worthy of philosophical attention. He wrote about fear, describing how it can overwhelm reason and distort perception, causing the mind to imagine dangers greater than reality. He wrote about habit, explaining how repeated actions shape human behavior so deeply that people often mistake learned behavior for natural instinct. He wrote about friendship, reflecting on the profound emotional connection he had shared with La Boétie and arguing that true friendship cannot be explained through utility or advantage, but exists as a rare harmony between individuals. One of his most important essays was titled Of Cannibals. In this essay, Montaigne examined reports of indigenous people from the Americas, whom European societies often described as primitive or savage. Instead of accepting these judgments, Montaigne questioned them. He argued that Europeans called others barbaric simply because their customs were different. Yet European societies themselves engaged in brutal wars, torture, and cruelty. He suggested that what people consider civilized or barbaric is often shaped by cultural perspective rather than objective truth. This essay introduced a revolutionary idea for its time. The idea that no culture possesses absolute authority to judge all others. Human beings must remain aware of their own limitations and biases. Montaigne's writings did not follow a rigid structure. His thoughts moved naturally, flowing from one observation to another, reflecting the way the human mind actually works. He allowed himself to change his opinion within the same essay if his reflection led him to a new understanding. This openness was intentional. He believed that pretending to possess absolute certainty was a form of intellectual dishonesty. Human beings learn through experience, and experience constantly alters understanding. His famous question, "What do I know?" became the guiding principle of his work. This question represented a form of philosophical skepticism, not in the sense of denying all knowledge, but in recognizing the limits of human certainty. Montaigne observed that people often cling to beliefs not because those beliefs are proven, but because they provide psychological comfort. Certainty creates the illusion of control in a world that is fundamentally unpredictable. By questioning certainty, Montaigne believed people could become more intellectually honest and less vulnerable to arrogance and fanaticism. During this period of writing and reflection, Montaigne's life was not completely isolated from the outside world. France was experiencing violent religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, known as the French Wars of Religion. These conflicts were not merely political disagreements. They involved deep ideological divisions that led to widespread violence, executions, and social instability. Montaigne observed these events with growing concern. He saw how absolute certainty in religious belief could lead individuals to justify cruelty. Each side believed they possessed ultimate truth, and this belief allowed them to treat opponents as enemies rather than fellow human beings. Montaigne's response to this environment was not to choose one side with blind loyalty, but to advocate for moderation, tolerance, and humility. He believed that recognizing the limits of human knowledge could reduce the tendency toward violence. If individuals accept that their understanding is incomplete, they may become less willing to impose their beliefs through force. His skepticism was not passive. It was a form of protection against extremism. In 1581, Montaigne was unexpectedly drawn back into public life when he was elected mayor of Bordeaux. This position placed him in a difficult role during a time of political and religious instability. As mayor, he was responsible for maintaining order and protecting the population. His leadership reflected his philosophical principles. He avoided ideological extremism and sought practical solutions that reduced conflict. He understood that governing required compromise and realism rather than rigid adherence to abstract ideals. Even while serving as mayor, Montaigne continued refining his essays. His writing became a lifelong project. He constantly revised his work, adding new reflections and modifying earlier ideas. This process reflected his belief that human understanding evolves over time. He did not see his essays as finished products, but as living documents that grew alongside his own experience. One of the most important themes in his later essays was the acceptance of human imperfection. Montaigne rejected the idea that philosophy should transform human beings into emotionless or flawless figures. He believed that emotions, weaknesses, and limitations are part of human nature. Instead of trying to eliminate these aspects, individuals should understand and accept them. He argued that wisdom does not come from becoming superhuman, but from becoming fully aware of one's own humanity. He also wrote extensively about death, a subject that had deeply affected him since the loss of his friend. In his essay titled "To Philosophize is to Learn How to Die," he argued that fear of death often prevents people from living fully. Death is inevitable, and attempting to avoid thinking about it creates unnecessary anxiety. By accepting mortality as a natural part of existence, individuals can focus more clearly on the present moment. This acceptance does not make death desirable, but it removes its power to dominate the mind. Montaigne's philosophy was deeply practical. He was not trying to create abstract systems detached from daily life. He was trying to understand how to live with clarity, balance, and peace. He observed that human beings often create unnecessary suffering through unrealistic expectations. They seek certainty where none exists. They seek permanence in a world defined by change. They seek control over forces beyond their reach. By recognizing these tendencies, Montaigne believed individuals could reduce their psychological burden. In his tower, surrounded by silence and thought, Montaigne was not escaping the world. He was studying it from a most intimate perspective possible, the perspective of his own mind. He understood that every human being lives within their own consciousness, interpreting reality through their own experience. By understanding himself honestly, he believed he was contributing to the understanding of humanity itself. His essays became more than a collection of personal reflections. They became a mirror in which every reader could see not Montaigne alone, but themselves. As Michel de Montaigne continued to revise and expand his essays over the years, his project gradually became something far greater than a personal intellectual exercise. It became a lifelong dialogue between himself and existence itself. He was not trying to arrive at final answers, because he had come to believe that human life does not offer final answers. Instead, he focused on observing how his thoughts evolved as he aged, as his body changed, and as the world around him shifted through violence, political instability, and uncertainty. He paid attention to the smallest details of his experience, recognizing that truth often reveals itself not in dramatic events, but in ordinary moments. He wrote about how his memory sometimes failed him, openly admitting that he often forgot names, details, and facts. Instead of hiding this weakness, he examined it. He realized that human identity cannot depend on perfect memory or perfect consistency. Human beings are fragile, incomplete, and constantly changing. This realization did not depress him. It freed him. He understood that it is not necessary to be perfect in order to live meaningfully. One of the most remarkable aspects of Montaigne's work was his honesty about his own contradictions. He did not attempt to present himself as always rational or always consistent. He openly admitted that his opinions shifted depending on his mood, his health, and his circumstances. He wrote that he did not portray being itself, but rather the passage. By this, he meant that he was documenting the process of becoming, not a fixed final state. He saw himself as a moving entity shaped by time and experience. This insight anticipated modern understandings of psychology and identity. He understood that the self is not a permanent object, but a continuous flow of perception, memory, and interpretation. During his later years, Montaigne also experienced increasing physical discomfort, particularly from kidney stones, a painful condition that caused intense suffering. These episodes forced him to confront the reality of physical pain directly. Rather than treating pain as an abstract philosophical topic, he experienced it in his own body. He observed how pain influenced his thoughts, emotions, and sense of self. He wrote about how physical suffering can narrow consciousness, focusing attention entirely on immediate sensation. Yet he also observed that the mind retains a degree of independence even within suffering. He could still reflect, observe, and interpret his experience. This reinforced his belief that human consciousness possesses a unique capacity for awareness, even in difficult conditions. In 1580, shortly after publishing the first edition of his essays, Montaigne began traveling across Europe, visiting countries such as Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. This journey exposed him to different cultures, customs, and political systems. He observed how people in different regions lived according to different traditions, yet each culture considered its own way natural and correct. This experience strengthened his skepticism toward claims of absolute certainty. He saw that human beliefs are shaped heavily by environment and habit. What one society considers normal, another may consider strange. This realization deepened his commitment to intellectual humility. He understood that no individual perspective can fully capture the complexity of reality. During his travels, he also visited Rome, the ancient center of the civilization he had admired since childhood. Walking through the ruins of the Roman Empire, he saw physical evidence of impermanence. Structures that once symbolized power and permanence had decayed. Empires that once dominated the world had disappeared. This reinforces understanding that all human achievements exist within time and are subject to change. Nothing external remains forever. This awareness did not lead him to despair. Instead, it shifted his attention toward the internal world, toward the cultivation of a stable mind capable of accepting change without being destroyed by it. As Montaigne aged, his writing became even more reflective. He wrote extensively about aging itself, observing how the body gradually weakens while consciousness continues. He described how aging alters perception, priorities, and emotional responses. He did not resist aging with denial. He accepted it as a natural process. He believed that resisting inevitable change creates unnecessary suffering. Acceptance, in his view, was not passive resignation, but clear recognition of reality. One of his most profound contributions was his examination of human ignorance. Montaigne argued that ignorance is not merely a lack of knowledge, but an inevitable part of human existence. Human perception is limited. The senses can deceive. Memory can distort. Reason itself can produce errors. Rather than treating ignorance as shameful, he treated it as a starting point for honest inquiry. He believed that acknowledging ignorance allows individuals to remain open, curious, and flexible. Pretending to possess certainty closes the mind. His essays continued to grow in size and depth throughout his life. He constantly returned to earlier passages, adding new reflections in the margins. This physical layering of thought reflected the evolving nature of his mind. His book became a record of consciousness unfolding over time. Readers could see not only his conclusions, but the process by which those conclusions changed. By the time he reached the final years of his life, Montaigne had achieved something unprecedented. He had created a new literary form. Before him, philosophy had often been impersonal, focused on universal principles detached from individual experience. Montaigne reversed this approach. He showed that the individual experience itself could become a path to universal insight. By studying one human life deeply and honestly, he revealed patterns that apply to all human lives. He was not trying to become a perfect philosopher. He was trying to become an honest observer. And through that honesty, he discovered something quietly revolutionary. The greatest mystery was not the universe outside. It was the consciousness within. As Michel de Montaigne entered the final stage of his life, his work had already begun to quietly transform intellectual history, though he himself did not fully realize the scale of his influence. He had never sought fame in the traditional sense. He had not attempted to build a formal philosophical system that others would be required to follow. He had not claimed to possess ultimate truth. Instead, he had done something far more rare and far more enduring. He had demonstrated what it means to observe oneself honestly. His essays were not instructions. They were examples. They showed what happens when a human being looks inward without illusion, without pretending to be more certain, more consistent, or more perfect than reality allows. He continued living in his chateau, surrounded by the familiar environment that had become both his physical home and his intellectual sanctuary. The Tower Library remained the center of his daily existence. There, he read, reflected, and revised his essays, sometimes adding small observations, sometimes expanding entire sections. He did not treat his earlier words as permanent. He allowed himself to change. This willingness to revise himself reflected one of his deepest insights: that human beings are not fixed. Identity is not something discovered once and preserved forever. It is something that evolves continuously. Montaigne accepted that the person he was at 60 was not the same as the person he had been at 30 or 40. Rather than seeing this as a loss of stability, he saw it as the natural movement of life itself. One of the most important themes that emerged in his later reflections was the idea of acceptance. Montaigne observed that much of human suffering comes not from external conditions themselves, but from resistance to those conditions. People suffer not only because pain exists, but because they believe pain should not exist. They suffer not only because death exists, but because they wish to deny its inevitability. Montaigne believed that peace becomes possible when individuals stop demanding that reality conform to their desires. Instead of fighting against the fundamental nature of existence, they can learn to live within it. This acceptance does not remove difficulty, but removes unnecessary psychological conflict. He also wrote about the illusion of control. Human beings often believe they can secure permanent stability through wealth, reputation, or achievement. But Montaigne had observed throughout his life that external conditions can change suddenly. Political systems collapse. Fortunes disappear. Health declines. Loved ones die. These events are not exceptions. They are part of the structure of existence. Attempting to base happiness on permanent external security leads to anxiety, because such security cannot be guaranteed. Montaigne concluded that the only reliable foundation for peace is internal. It is the ability to adapt mentally to changing circumstances. His reflections on death became even more calm and clear as he aged. Earlier in his life, death had appeared as a distant abstraction, but as he grew older, it became a visible and approaching reality. Rather than fearing it, he treated it as a natural conclusion of life. He wrote that to practice philosophy is to prepare for death, not in a morbid sense, but in the sense of removing the fear that death creates. He believed that fear of death prevents people from living fully. When individuals accept mortality, they become free to focus on the present moment rather than constantly worrying about the future. Montaigne also reflected deeply on the limitations of human knowledge. Despite decades of reading and thinking, he never claimed to possess complete understanding. Instead, his knowledge had led him to greater humility. He saw that every answer leads to new questions. Every certainty contains hidden assumptions. He believed that intellectual humility is not weakness but strength. It protects individuals from arrogance and fanaticism. It keeps the mind open and flexible. His essays contain hundreds of references to classical authors such as Seneca, Plutarch, Epicurus, and Cicero. These thinkers were not distant historical figures to him. They were companions in his reflection. He entered into conversation with them across time, comparing their ideas with his own experience. Yet he did not treat them as authorities that must be obeyed. He treated them as fellow human beings, each attempting to understand existence from their own perspective. He believed that wisdom does not come from blindly accepting authority, but from examining ideas personally and honestly. On September 13th, 1592, Michel de Montaigne died at the age of 59. His death occurred quietly, without dramatic event. He left behind no formal philosophical school, no institution, and no organized movement. Yet he left behind something far more powerful. He left behind a method. He showed that philosophy does not need to begin with abstract theories about the universe. It can begin with simple, honest observation of one's own experience. After his death, his essays continued to spread across Europe. Writers, philosophers, and thinkers discovered his work and recognized its originality. He influenced figures such as René Descartes, Blaise Pascal, Friedrich Nietzsche, and countless others. He helped shape the development of modern philosophy, psychology, and literature. He demonstrated that the individual mind itself could become a subject worthy of deep exploration. His legacy endures because the problem he confronted remains the same for every human being. Each person finds themselves alive without having chosen to be born. Each person exists within uncertainty. Each person must interpret their experience without absolute guidance. Montaigne did not offer rigid solutions. He offered something more subtle. He offered an example of how to live with awareness, humility, and honesty. He showed that wisdom is not the possession of perfect knowledge. It is the acceptance of imperfect knowledge. It is the ability to live without pretending to be certain. In the quiet tower of his chateau, Michel de Montaigne discovered that the greatest philosophical journey does not lead outward into the world. It leads inward, into the endless, changing, mysterious landscape of the human mind.